Samuel Mitchell had walked these mountain trails for 23 years, seeking the peace that only wilderness could provide. At 62, he knew every creek bend and ridgeline in these Colorado mountains. But on this crisp October morning, something was terribly wrong. The forest had gone silent except for one heartbreaking sound, a child's desperate plea echoing through the pines. "Please help me! They want to hurt my mom." The voice belonged to a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, and it was coming from somewhere deep in the woods, where no child should be. Samuel stopped dead in his tracks, his weathered hands gripping his walking stick. He had served as a small-town sheriff for 30 years before retirement, and every instinct told him this was no lost hiker situation. But what could an aging man with a bad knee possibly do against whatever evil had brought a terrified child to these remote mountains? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The child's voice faded into the wind, but Samuel Mitchell couldn't shake it from his mind. He stood motionless on the familiar trail, his calloused fingers finding the tarnished silver badge buried deep in his backpack's side pocket. 3 years since retirement, and he still carried it everywhere, though he'd never admitted that to anyone. Sheriff Samuel Mitchell. That's who he'd been for 3 decades in Pine Ridge, a town of barely 4,000 souls nestled in these same mountains. He'd handled everything from domestic disputes to the occasional meth lab, but nothing had prepared him for the quiet that followed Margaret's funeral. Cancer had taken her slowly, methodically, the way it stripped away everything good in their small world. The badge felt heavier in those final months, when every call pulled him away from her bedside. After the burial, Samuel had handed in his resignation the same day. Mayor Henderson had begged him to reconsider, offered him part-time work, consulting positions, anything to keep the town's most experienced lawman around. But Samuel needed distance from the memories, from the patrol routes that passed their house, from the dispatcher's voice that reminded him of Margaret's gentle corrections when he'd stumbled through radio protocol in his early days. These mountains had become his sanctuary. Every morning at dawn, he'd lace up his hiking boots and disappear into the wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The trails knew him now, welcomed him like an old friend. He'd mapped every deer path, knew which streams ran cleanest, could predict weather changes by the way the wind shifted through the canyon walls. The walking stick in his hands had been carved from oak during his first month of retirement, when grief had made sleep impossible and he'd needed something to do with his hands. Margaret had always said he was good with woodwork, though he'd never had time to pursue it seriously. Now the stick was worn smooth from 3 years of constant use, its surface bearing the scars of countless miles across rough terrain. His morning routine had become sacred. Coffee at 5, toast and eggs at 5:30, boots on by 6. He'd drive the 20 minutes from his cabin to whichever trailhead called to him that day, then walk until his bad knee reminded him he wasn't 20 anymore. The knee had been bothering him since a foot chase 15 years back, when he'd tackled a burglary suspect through a barbed wire fence. Margaret had fussed over him for weeks, bringing ice packs and insisting he elevate the leg while she cooked dinner. But today felt different. The October air carried an edge he couldn't identify, and now this impossible sound. Children simply didn't wander alone into these remote areas. The nearest camping area was 12 miles back towards civilization, and this section of trail required serious hiking experience to navigate safely. He'd seen maybe 6 other hikers up here in the past month, all of them seasoned outdoorsmen with proper gear and detailed maps. Samuel pulled out his water bottle and took a slow sip, buying time while his mind processed what he'd heard. The voice had been real, not some trick of wind through the trees or echo from a distant campground. It carried the unmistakable desperation of genuine terror, the kind he'd heard too many times during domestic violence calls. A child in immediate danger, calling for help in the middle of nowhere. His sheriff's instincts warred with common sense. Protocol said, call for backup, establish communication with dispatch, approach with caution and proper support. But his radio was 20 miles away in his truck. His phone showed no signal bars this deep in the mountains, and whoever had frightened that child was here now. By the time he could hike back to civilization and return with proper authorities, anything could happen. The badge felt warm against his fingers, as if reminding him of oaths he'd sworn decades ago. To serve and protect, to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them, to never walk away when someone needed help, regardless of personal cost or convenience. Margaret would have understood. She'd married a man who couldn't ignore suffering, even when it meant missed dinners and interrupted vacations. During their 35 years together, she'd learned to accept that his conscience wouldn't let him turn away from people in trouble. It was what made him a good sheriff, she'd always said, even when it made him a sometimes absent husband. Samuel secured the badge back in his pack and adjusted his grip on the walking stick. Whatever lay ahead, he'd face it the same way he'd handled every crisis in Pine Ridge, with careful observation, measured response, and the determination to see justice done. His retirement could wait. Samuel left the main trail, following the faint echo of the child's voice deeper into the wilderness. The terrain grew rougher with each step, forcing him to use his walking stick for balance as he navigated fallen logs and loose rock. His grandfather's compass, a brass antique that had guided him through countless hiking expeditions, began spinning erratically in his palm. The needle jumped between directions as if something was interfering with its magnetic field. He'd inherited the compass from his grandfather, a railroad surveyor who'd mapped much of this mountain region in the 1940s. The old man had sworn by its accuracy, claiming it had never led him astray in 40 years of wilderness work. Samuel had carried it on every hike since Margaret's death, finding comfort in its steady reliability. Now watching the needle dance wildly, he felt an unsettling premonition that this situation would challenge more than just his sense of direction. The forest seemed to press closer around him as he descended into an unmarked valley. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked most of the morning sunlight. The air grew cooler and carried an odd stillness, as if wildlife had abandoned this particular stretch of woods. Even the ever-present mountain birds had gone silent, leaving only the crunch of his boots on pine needles and the distant sound of running water. Samuel paused every few minutes to listen, hoping to hear the child's voice again. The calls had stopped, which worried him more than if they'd continued. Either the girl had found safety or something had silenced her. Neither possibility offered much comfort, given the remote location and the desperation he'd heard in her plea. His bad knee protested as he worked his way down a steep embankment, using his walking stick to test each foothold before committing his full weight. The injury had been a constant reminder of his limitations since leaving law enforcement. But today he pushed through the discomfort with the focused determination that had served him well during difficult investigations. Pain was temporary. A child in danger was urgent. The sound of water grew louder as he approached what appeared to be a natural clearing. Through the trees, he caught glimpses of a creek running swift and clear over moss-covered rocks. The valley opened up ahead, revealing a hidden meadow that didn't appear on any topographical map he'd studied. It was the kind of place that existed in the spaces between marked trails, known only to wildlife and the occasional experienced hiker willing to venture off established paths. But as Samuel reached the edge of the tree line, he realized this meadow wasn't as untouched as it appeared. Fresh tire tracks cut deep grooves through the grass, and the smell of vehicle exhaust lingered faintly in the clean mountain air. Someone had brought motorized equipment into this remote location recently, probably within the last day or two, based on how clearly the tracks were defined. His sheriff's instincts kicked into full alert. Legitimate visitors to wilderness areas used marked trails and established camping zones. People who drove vehicles into hidden valleys were usually trying to avoid detection, and that rarely indicated legal activity. Drug operations, illegal dumping, poaching, weapons storage. He'd seen all of it during his years in law enforcement, though never in locations this remote. Samuel crouched behind a massive boulder and studied the clearing more carefully. The tire tracks converged near a stand of aspen trees on the far side of the meadow, but thick undergrowth obscured whatever lay beyond. He could make out what looked like a structure through the branches, partially hidden but clearly man-made. The roof line was wrong for a park service building or ranger station, and too substantial for a hunting blind. His broken compass spun lazily in his palm, completely useless now. Whatever was affecting its magnetic field was strongest in this valley, which suggested either significant metal deposits in the ground or electronic equipment powerful enough to create interference. Given the tire tracks and hidden structure, he suspected the latter. The child's voice had led him here, but where was she now? Samuel scanned the meadow for any sign of movement, any indication that people were present. The silence felt heavy and wrong, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when even insects stopped their constant chatter. He checked his watch. Almost 2 hours since he'd first heard the cry for help. If the girl was hiding somewhere in this valley, she'd been silent and still for far too long. If she'd been taken into that hidden structure, time was running out to help her. Samuel tucked the useless compass into his pocket and gripped his walking stick tighter. Whatever lay ahead, he was committed now. Samuel moved carefully through the aspen grove, using the thick tree trunks for cover as he approached the hidden structure. What he found made his blood run cold. A rustic log cabin sat nestled against the valley's back wall. But this wasn't some innocent hunting lodge or wilderness retreat. 3 black SUVs with mud-caked license plates were parked in a rough semicircle around the building, their engines still warm enough to create faint heat shimmer in the cool mountain air. Hanging from a low pine branch near the cabin's entrance, a small purple backpack swayed gently in the breeze. The fabric was torn in several places, and one of the straps had been cut clean through, as if someone had grabbed it while the wearer was trying to escape. Samuel recognized it as a child's school bag, the kind parents bought for elementary students. Inside the front pocket, he could see the corner of what looked like a homework folder, confirming that this belonged to a school-age child. The sight of that abandoned backpack hit Samuel harder than any crime scene he'd encountered during his law enforcement career. It represented innocence violated, a child's normal world shattered by forces beyond her understanding. Whoever had brought that little girl to this remote place had done so against her will, and the torn straps suggested she'd fought against her captors even when escape seemed impossible. Samuel counted at least 5 different sets of footprints in the soft earth around the cabin. Boot treads from heavy hiking shoes mixed with smaller impressions that could have come from athletic shoes or sneakers. The patterns told a story of struggle and resistance, with scuff marks indicating someone had been dragged across the ground toward the building's front entrance. Through the cabin's single window, he could see movement and hear the low murmur of male voices. At least 3 men were inside, possibly more in areas not visible from his current position. Their conversation carried the casual tone of people comfortable in their surroundings, suggesting they'd been using this location for some time. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or passion. It was organized, planned, and ongoing. The cabin itself had been modified for purposes that had nothing to do with wilderness recreation. A generator hummed quietly behind the building, providing electrical power that shouldn't exist this far from civilization. Multiple antenna arrays sprouted from the roof, indicating sophisticated communication equipment. Heavy-duty power cables snaked across the ground, connecting the generator to what appeared to be additional equipment housed in a storage shed behind the main structure. Samuel's law enforcement experience recognized the setup immediately. Drug operations required reliable communication with suppliers and distributors. Human trafficking networks needed secure ways to coordinate transportation and exchange information about their victims. Money laundering schemes demanded constant contact with financial institutions and criminal partners. Whatever was happening in this hidden valley, It was serious enough to justify significant investment in infrastructure and security. The backpack swayed again, and Samuel noticed something that made his stomach clench. Fresh blood stained the torn fabric near the shoulder strap, dark red drops that hadn't yet dried completely. The child who'd worn this bag had been injured during whatever struggle led to its abandonment. She might be bleeding somewhere in the wilderness, or worse. She might be inside that cabin with people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence against a child. Movement caught his eye through the cabin window. A large man in camouflage clothing walked past, carrying what was unmistakably an assault rifle. Not a hunting weapon or sporting gun, but military-grade hardware designed for combat situations. The casual way he carried it suggested these weren't amateurs playing at being criminals. They were professionals, armed and dangerous, operating with the confidence that comes from successful experience. Samuel felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, the same burden he'd carried for 30 years as a sheriff. Somewhere in this valley, a terrified child needed help. Her mother was in danger, possibly already dead. The authorities were hours away, and every minute of delay increased the likelihood that more innocent people would be hurt. The torn backpack hanging in the pine tree was more than evidence. It was a call to action, a reminder that evil prospered when good people chose personal safety over moral obligation. Samuel had spent 3 years trying to forget the weight of that responsibility. But some things couldn't be ignored. He checked his pistol, a .38 revolver he'd carried during his final years as sheriff and still kept as backup protection during solo hiking trips. 6 rounds against unknown numbers of well-armed criminals weren't favorable odds, but they were the only odds he had. Samuel was studying the cabin's defenses when a small hand touched his shoulder. He spun around, raising his walking stick defensively, only to find himself face to face with a little girl no more than 8 years old. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a dirt-streaked face, and her clothes were torn from pushing through undergrowth. But it was her eyes that broke Samuel's heart. They held the kind of terror that children should never experience, the hollow look of someone who'd witnessed unthinkable things. Around her neck hung a small, heart-shaped locket, tarnished silver that caught what little sunlight filtered through the trees. The pendant seemed too old and valuable for a child to wear, suggesting it held special significance. When she noticed Samuel looking at it, her small fingers closed protectively around the metal, as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to hope. "Please don't let them find me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mountain breeze. "My name is Sarah, and they took my mommy. They said they were going to hurt her if she doesn't tell them what they want to know." Samuel knelt to her level, keeping his voice calm and reassuring despite the rage building in his chest. "I'm here to help, Sarah. Can you tell me what happened?" Sarah glanced nervously toward the cabin before answering. "We were driving to see my grandmother in Denver when our car broke down on the mountain road. These men in a black truck stopped and said they would help us, but then they put us in their car instead. They brought us here and put Mommy in that house with the bad men." Her small hands shook as she opened the locket, revealing a tiny photograph of herself with a young woman who shared her dark hair and gentle features. "This was my mommy's when she was little like me. She gave it to me when Daddy went away and said as long as I wore it, she would always be with me. But I don't think it's working anymore because those men took her away from me." Samuel's trained eye caught details that painted a clearer picture of their situation. Sarah's clothes, while dirty and torn, were good quality. Her shoes were expensive sneakers, barely worn. The locket was genuine silver, probably an antique. This wasn't a random kidnapping of convenience. Someone had specifically targeted Sarah and her mother, which meant there was more to this story than a simple crime of opportunity. "Sarah, I need you to think carefully. Did the men say anything about why they wanted your mommy? Did they mention your daddy or ask her questions about anything specific?" The little girl nodded solemnly. "They keep asking her about money that Daddy hid before he went away. Mommy keeps telling them she doesn't know where it is, but they don't believe her. One of the scary men said they would hurt me if she doesn't remember soon. The pieces began falling into place in Samuel's mind. Elena, Sarah's mother, was being held because her absent husband had stolen or hidden money from dangerous people. The criminals were using Sarah as leverage to force Elena's cooperation, a tactic that required keeping both mother and daughter alive until they got what they wanted. It was brutal but logical, which meant these weren't impulsive criminals acting on emotion. How did you get away from them, sweetheart? When they brought Mommy inside, they left me in one of the cars with the windows down because it was getting hot. I'm small, so I squeezed out and ran into the trees. I've been hiding since yesterday morning, but I'm scared and hungry, and I don't know how to help Mommy. Yesterday morning, Sarah had been alone in the wilderness for over 24 hours, hiding from armed criminals while worrying about her mother's safety. The courage that must have taken from someone so young was remarkable, but Samuel could see exhaustion and fear taking their toll. Her lips were chapped from dehydration, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone fighting to stay alert, despite overwhelming fatigue. "You did exactly the right thing by hiding and staying quiet," Samuel assured her, "and you're very brave for wanting to help your mommy. But now I need you to trust me, okay? I used to be a sheriff, which means I know how to deal with bad men like these." Sarah studied his weathered face with the intensity children reserved for adults they were trying to decide whether to trust. Finally, she nodded and reached out to take his hand. "Will you really help us? Even though it's dangerous?" Samuel squeezed her small fingers gently, feeling the weight of promise in that simple gesture. "I give you my word, Sarah, we're going to get your mommy back." Samuel positioned Sarah behind a massive fallen log and pulled his old binoculars from his pack. The right lens bore a spider web crack from when he dropped them during a pursuit 5 years ago, but they still provided clear magnification of the cabin below. Through the damaged glass, he began methodically cataloguing the threats they faced. The binoculars had been his companion through countless surveillance operations during his sheriff days. Margaret had bought them for his 50th birthday, joking that he was getting too old to rely on naked-eye observation. The crack had appeared during his final year on the force, when he'd stumbled while chasing a methamphetamine dealer through Pine Ridge's warehouse district. He'd kept meaning to replace them after retirement, but somehow the damaged equipment felt appropriate. Like him, they still functioned despite being worn and imperfect. Through the fractured lens, Samuel counted 5 men moving around the cabin with military precision. They weren't the usual small-town criminals he'd dealt with as sheriff. These were professionals who understood tactical positioning and maintained constant awareness of their surroundings. 2 guards walked perimeter routes that overlapped to eliminate blind spots. A 3rd man monitored radio communications from a position near the antenna array. The remaining 2 stayed close to the cabin entrance, armed with automatic weapons that they handled with practiced familiarity. Their equipment confirmed Samuel's worst fears. Night vision goggles hung from tactical vests, indicating they were prepared for operations in darkness. Multiple vehicles suggested escape routes had been planned and rehearsed. The sophisticated communication setup meant they had contact with larger criminal networks that could provide backup or coordinate parallel operations. This wasn't an isolated crime, but part of something much bigger and more dangerous. The cabin's windows had been covered with heavy blankets, making it impossible to see inside or determine Elena's exact location. However, the building's layout was fairly standard for wilderness structures of its age. Single story, probably 3 rooms maximum, with limited exit options. If Elena was being held inside, she was likely in a back room away from the main entrance, both to muffle any sounds and to make rescue attempts more difficult. Samuel adjusted the focus on his cracked binoculars and studied the guards' weapons more carefully. Military-grade assault rifles, probably stolen or purchased through black market channels. High-capacity magazines, tactical sights, and suppressors that would muffle gunfire in the remote mountain location. These men were equipped for serious combat, not simple intimidation or crowd control. Sarah crouched beside him, trying to see through the fallen log's gaps. "Is that where they have Mommy?" "Yes, sweetheart, but we need to be very careful. These are dangerous men who know what they're doing." Samuel kept his voice calm, but his mind was racing through tactical assessments learned during his brief military service before joining law enforcement. 5 armed professionals against 1 aging sheriff and a terrified child. No backup, no communication with outside authorities, and no easy escape routes if things went wrong. The guard rotation patterns revealed both strengths and weaknesses in their security setup. They maintained good coverage during daylight hours, but their routes were predictable after 15 minutes of observation. More importantly, they were focused on preventing people from approaching the cabin, not on stopping someone from leaving. Their attention was directed outward, toward potential threats from law enforcement or rival criminals, not inward toward their prisoners. Through the binoculars, Samuel watched one guard check his watch and speak into a handheld radio. The response came immediately, indicating tight communication protocols and probably scheduled check-ins with outside coordination. If this team missed a scheduled contact, backup would likely arrive within hours. Any rescue attempt would have to be fast and decisive. The generator's constant hum masked most sound from inside the cabin, but occasionally Samuel caught fragments of raised voices. Male voices demanding answers, and once faintly what sounded like a woman crying. Elena was alive, but under severe stress. The longer she was held, the more desperate her captors would become, and desperate criminals made increasingly dangerous decisions. Samuel lowered the binoculars and turned to Sarah. Her small face was set with determination that reminded him of Margaret during her final months, when pain couldn't diminish her strength of will. "Sarah, I need to ask you some important questions about the inside of that cabin. When they brought you and your mommy there, did you see the rooms? Can you remember how they were arranged?" The little girl nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to have something useful to contribute. "I can draw it for you. Mommy taught me to remember details when we play memory games." Samuel smiled grimly. They would need every advantage they could get. Samuel tore a page from Sarah's homework folder and spread it flat against a smooth section of the fallen log. Using a pencil stub from his pack, he began sketching the cabin's layout based on Sarah's surprisingly detailed memory. The 8-year-old had absorbed more information during her terrifying ordeal than most adults would have noticed, describing room dimensions, window placements, and even the locations of furniture with remarkable accuracy. The hand-drawn map revealed both opportunities and obstacles. The cabin's front entrance opened directly into a main room, where the guards spent most of their time. Elena was being held in a back bedroom, accessible through a narrow hallway that offered no cover for anyone attempting a rescue. 2 windows provided the only alternative entry points, but both were visible from guard positions outside the building. "They moved the big table against the back door," Sarah explained, pointing to her addition to Samuel's sketch. "And there's only one way to get to Mommy's room, unless you go through where all the scary men are sitting." Samuel studied the crude map, while his mind catalogued available resources. His hiking gear included rope, a multi-tool, emergency flares, and basic first aid supplies. Not exactly tactical equipment, but 30 years of creative problem-solving had taught him to work with whatever was available. The terrain around the cabin offered several advantages if he could create the right distractions at the right moments. "Sarah, this is very important. When you escaped, did you see any other cars or trucks nearby? Any sign that more men might be coming?" She shook her head. "Just the 3 black cars. But I heard one of the men talking on his radio about someone called Marcus, who was supposed to check in every few hours. They seemed worried because he hadn't called when he was supposed to." Marcus. Either another member of their criminal organization or possibly someone monitoring their operation from outside. If Marcus was law enforcement conducting surveillance, his absence might indicate that help was closer than Samuel had hoped. If Marcus was another criminal who'd run into trouble, It meant additional complications were developing beyond this immediate situation. Samuel began outlining his plan on the paper, using simple diagrams and arrows that Sarah could understand. "We need to get those guards away from the cabin so I can reach your mommy. That means creating a distraction big enough to pull their attention away, but not so obvious that they suspect someone is trying to rescue her." The little girl studied his drawings with intense concentration. "What kind of distraction? Remember how you escaped by being small and quiet? Well, you're going to help me again, but this time by being loud and obvious in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time." Samuel pointed to a ridge overlooking the meadow from the opposite direction. "If you can get up there and create enough noise to make them think someone is approaching from that side, they'll move to investigate. That gives me a chance to approach the cabin from behind." Sarah's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and excitement. "But what if they catch me?" "They won't, because you're not going to wait around for them to get close. As soon as you make the noise, you run back into the deep woods and hide until everything is over. You know these mountains better than they do after surviving out here for a day and a half." Samuel added more details to the map, marking escape routes and rendezvous points. His military training had emphasized the importance of contingency planning, and this situation called for multiple backup options. If the distraction failed, if Elena was moved before he could reach her, if additional criminals arrived unexpectedly, they needed alternative approaches ready to implement immediately. What about Mommy? What if she's hurt and can't run? The question Samuel had been dreading. Elena might be injured, drugged, or too weak from captivity to move quickly. Carrying an unconscious or semi-conscious woman through rough terrain while evading armed pursuit would be nearly impossible for a 62-year-old man with a bad knee. But leaving her behind wasn't an option either. We'll figure that out when we get to her. The important thing is that we try, Sarah. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks, even when we're scared. Samuel folded the map carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. The crude drawing represented more than tactical planning. It was a promise to a frightened child and a commitment to principles that had guided his entire adult life. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he would know that he hadn't walked away when innocent people needed help. Samuel pulled his cell phone from his pack and stared at the blank screen displaying "No service" in stark letters. The device that had connected him to the outside world for years was now nothing more than dead weight in this remote valley. No way to call for backup, no method to contact emergency services, no communication with anyone who might provide assistance. They were completely isolated, facing professional criminals with only their wits and determination. The phone's uselessness symbolized everything wrong with their situation. In Pine Ridge, Samuel had always been able to radio for support, coordinate with other officers, or call in specialized units when situations exceeded local capabilities. Here in the wilderness, all those safety nets had vanished. If something went wrong during the rescue attempt, no one would even know where to look for their bodies. Samuel began moving toward his reconnaissance position, keeping low and using the natural terrain for concealment. The military tactics he'd learned decades ago came flooding back, muscle memory guiding his approach even as his aging body protested the physical demands. Stay low, move slow, observe everything, assume nothing. Basic principles that had kept soldiers alive in hostile territory for generations. He reached a position 50 yards from the cabin's rear wall and settled behind a cluster of boulders to observe the guards' patterns more closely. Through his cracked binoculars, he could see two men maintaining their perimeter patrol, while a third monitored radio communications near the front entrance. Their discipline was impressive but not perfect. After 20 minutes of observation, Samuel identified a gap in their coverage that lasted exactly 90 seconds during each rotation cycle. The guard with the radio appeared increasingly agitated as time passed. He checked his watch frequently and spoke into his handheld device with growing urgency. The responses he received were obviously unsatisfactory, judging by his body language and the way he gestured angrily at the other men. Something was disrupting their normal operational routine, and that disruption was making them nervous. Samuel caught fragments of conversation when the wind shifted in his direction. References to someone called Marcus, who hadn't reported in, concerns about a schedule that was falling behind, and mentions of a boss who wouldn't tolerate delays. The criminal organization was clearly larger than just this five-man team, with supervisors expecting regular updates and predetermined timelines for whatever they were trying to accomplish with Elena. From his concealed position, Samuel could hear sounds from inside the cabin more clearly. Male voices asking repeated questions, growing more aggressive with each exchange. Elena's voice responding, sometimes pleading, sometimes defiant, always exhausted. The interrogation had been going on for hours, possibly since the previous evening, and everyone involved was reaching their breaking point. A new voice joined the conversation inside, someone giving orders with the authority of leadership. The tone changed immediately, becoming more focused and urgent. Samuel couldn't make out specific words, but the implications were clear. Time was running out for Elena, and whatever patience her captors had maintained was rapidly disappearing. The guard near the radio suddenly straightened and began waving to his colleagues. He'd received a message that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. The other men converged on his position, their casual alertness replaced by focused intensity. Samuel watched through his binoculars as they gathered around the radio operator, listening to instructions that caused visible changes in their posture and behavior. One guard jogged toward the vehicles, while another entered the cabin, presumably to report the new development to whoever was in charge. The remaining men began checking their weapons and equipment with the efficiency of people preparing for immediate action. Something had happened that accelerated their timeline dramatically. Samuel realized with growing alarm that his window of opportunity was closing faster than anticipated. Whatever message had come through that radio had triggered preparations for either departure or escalation. If they were planning to move Elena to another location, this might be his only chance to reach her. If they were preparing to eliminate witnesses because their operation had been compromised, every minute of delay increased the danger to both Elena and Sarah. His dead cell phone felt like a weight in his pocket, a reminder of how completely they were cut off from outside help. Whatever happened next, Samuel would have to act on his own judgment with incomplete information and inadequate resources. The phone's blank screen reflected his own sense of isolation, but it also freed him from waiting for backup that would never come. Samuel crept closer to the cabin's rear wall, his heart pounding as he spotted something that made his blood run cold. On the wooden floor near the back window lay a simple gold wedding ring, glinting faintly in the dim light filtering through the covered glass. The band was thin and worn, the kind of ring that spoke of years of faithful marriage rather than expensive luxury. It had clearly been dropped or thrown there recently, and Samuel knew with terrible certainty that it belonged to Elena. The wedding ring represented everything these criminals were trying to destroy: a mother's commitment to her family, the bonds that held innocent lives together, the sacred promises that evil people violated without conscience. Seeing it abandoned on that dirty floor filled Samuel with a rage he hadn't felt since his early days as a sheriff. When domestic violence cases had tested his ability to remain professional and objective, he positioned himself beneath the window and listened carefully to the conversation inside. 3 distinct male voices growing more agitated by the minute. Elena's voice, weaker now but still defiant, refusing to give them information about money her ex-husband had hidden. The questions had become threats. The threats had become promises of violence, and Samuel could hear the desperation building toward a breaking point that would end badly for everyone. "Last chance, lady. Tell us where Martinez hid the accounts, or we start sending pieces of your daughter to him in prison." Samuel's training took over, suppressing emotion in favor of tactical thinking. Elena's ex-husband was named Martinez and was currently in prison. The money they were seeking was hidden in accounts that Elena either couldn't or wouldn't access. The criminals were using both Elena and Sarah as leverage to force cooperation, which meant they needed both victims alive until they got what they wanted. That gave Samuel a narrow window of opportunity, but only if he acted immediately. The window latch was old and corroded, but it moved with minimal noise when Samuel applied steady pressure. Military training had taught him patience during infiltration operations. Rush the entry and alert the guards. Take time to do it right and maintain the element of surprise. His aging joints protested as he worked the latch free, but adrenaline masked most of the discomfort. Inside the cabin, Eleanor's voice rose in anguish. "I told you 100 times. I don't know anything about Miguel's business. We've been divorced for 2 years. He never told me where he kept his money. Your ex-husband stole $2 million from our operation before the feds arrested him. That money belongs to us, and we know he set up accounts that only family members can access. You and the kid are the only family he's got left." Samuel eased the window open, just wide enough to squeeze through. The room appeared to be a small bedroom, currently empty, but showing signs of recent occupancy. Elena's purse sat on a wooden chair, its contents scattered as if someone had searched through it hastily. Her jacket hung on a door hook, one sleeve torn and stained with what looked like dried blood. He could hear movement in the main room, heavy footsteps crossing wooden floors. Someone was pacing with the agitated energy of a person under pressure from superiors. The radio crackled periodically with incoming messages that seemed to increase rather than decrease the tension level. "The boss says we've got 6 hours to get those account numbers. After that, we eliminate the witnesses and move to Plan B." Plan B. Samuel had heard enough criminal conversations during his sheriff career to know that Plan B usually involved removing evidence, which meant killing anyone who could identify the perpetrators. Elena and Sarah had perhaps 6 hours left to live, unless something changed the dynamic of this situation dramatically. Samuel pulled himself through the window with practiced silence, grateful for all those early morning hikes that had kept him in reasonable physical condition. His feet touched the floor without sound, and he immediately moved to the bedroom door to assess the layout Sarah had described. The narrow hallway stretched ahead, leading to the main room where at least 3 armed men held Elena prisoner. Elena's wedding ring caught his eye again, and Samuel carefully picked it up from the floor. The metal was warm from lying in the sunlight, and he could see an inscription on the inside. "Forever yours, Miguel." Whatever mistakes her ex-husband had made, Elena was paying the price for his crimes. But not if Samuel could help it. Samuel froze when he heard the back door creak open behind him. Footsteps entered the cabin with practiced stealth, too careful to belong to one of the criminals he'd been observing. He pressed himself against the bedroom wall, gripping his walking stick like a weapon, as someone moved through the kitchen area with professional silence. The intruder was good, but not good enough to avoid the loose floorboard near the refrigerator that Samuel had noted during his reconnaissance. A 2-way radio crackled softly in the hallway. The volume turned low to avoid detection. Samuel caught fragments of a whispered transmission. "Base, this is Marcus. I'm inside the structure. Targets are in the main room, preparing to make contact with hostages, Marcus. The missing person the criminals had been worried about." But this voice carried the clipped precision of law enforcement, not the casual aggression Samuel had heard from the kidnappers. Someone else was conducting their own rescue operation, and their timing couldn't have been more dangerous or more fortunate. Samuel made a calculated decision and whispered toward the hallway. "Federal agent." The footsteps stopped immediately. A long pause, then a voice responded quietly. "Retired sheriff?" Relief flooded through Samuel as he realized he wasn't alone anymore. "Samuel Mitchell, Pine Ridge County Sheriff, retired." "You Marcus?" "Agent Marcus Rivera, DEA. I've been tracking this cell for 8 months. What's your situation?" Samuel moved carefully toward the hallway, keeping his voice barely audible. "Child's mother is being held in the main room. Daughter is safe but hidden outside. 5 armed suspects, military-grade weapons, demanding information about hidden money. The two-way radio in Marcus's hands was standard federal equipment, designed for secure communication between field agents and command centers. But like Samuel's cell phone, it was useless in this remote valley where normal communication systems couldn't penetrate. Marcus was as cut off from backup as Samuel was, facing the same impossible odds with the same limited resources. I was supposed to maintain surveillance until a tactical team could be positioned, Marcus explained. But they moved up their timeline after my cover got blown yesterday. My extraction got compromised, and I've been hiding in the woods since dawn. Samuel studied the younger man through the dim hallway light. Marcus appeared to be in his mid-30s, with the lean build and alert eyes of someone accustomed to dangerous undercover work. His equipment was professional grade but minimal, suggesting he'd been operating solo for an extended period. Dark stubble covered his jaw, and his clothes showed the wear of someone who'd spent uncomfortable hours in outdoor concealment. "How many in the main room?" Marcus asked. 3 confirmed, possibly 4. They're getting increasingly agitated about missing deadlines. Radio traffic suggests they're under pressure from supervisors to wrap this up quickly. Marcus nodded grimly. Miguel Martinez was laundering money for the Herrera cartel before his arrest. These are serious people who don't leave witnesses. If we don't get Elena out soon, they'll eliminate her whether she talks or not. The radio in Marcus's hand crackled with static, but no voices came through. Whatever communication network he'd been using to coordinate with federal agencies had apparently failed in this mountain valley. They were truly on their own. 2 law enforcement officers from different generations and agencies, united by circumstance and shared commitment to protecting innocent lives. "What's your plan?" Samuel asked. "I was going to wait for backup, but that's not an option anymore." "We create a diversion, extract the hostage, and try to maintain custody of at least 1 suspect for interrogation." Marcus checked his service weapon, a 9mm pistol with 2 spare magazines. "You military?" "Army, long time ago. 30 years as county sheriff after that. I know how to handle myself in a crisis." Marcus studied Samuel's weathered face and seemed to find what he was looking for. "Okay, Sheriff, let's go save Elena Martinez and put these bastards where they belong." The two-way radio represented more than failed communication. It symbolized the moment when Samuel stopped being a lone retiree trying to help a child and became part of an official law enforcement operation again. For the first time since entering this valley, he wasn't facing professional criminals with nothing but hiking gear and determination. He had a partner, someone who understood tactics and shared the burden of responsibility. But the radios. Silence also reminded them both that success or failure rested entirely on their shoulders. Samuel wrapped Elena's torn and blood-stained bandana around a shallow cut on his forearm, the result of diving through thick undergrowth when the criminals had spotted movement near the cabin's rear window. The fabric was soft cotton, probably a cheerful color, before it had been stained with evidence of violence. Now it served as both bandage and grim reminder of what Elena had endured during her captivity. The situation had deteriorated rapidly after one of the guards noticed the open bedroom window. Within minutes, the entire criminal operation had shifted from passive containment to active hunting mode. Samuel and Marcus found themselves fleeing through dense forest with at least 4 armed men in pursuit. Their carefully planned rescue attempt collapsing into a desperate fight for survival. "They're using military tracking techniques," Marcus whispered as they crouched behind a fallen pine tree, listening to their pursuers coordinate through handheld radios. Sweep patterns, communication protocols, coordinated movement. "These aren't street criminals." Samuel pressed the bandana tighter against his wound, feeling Elena's blood mix with his own. The fabric represented everything wrong with this situation. An innocent woman's suffering, the failure of his rescue attempt, the violence that seemed to follow him even in retirement. But it also represented determination. Elena had fought her captors despite overwhelming odds, just as he would continue fighting despite the current circumstances. The sound of breaking branches grew closer as their pursuers narrowed the search area. Samuel's knowledge of these mountains provided some advantage, but the criminals were systematic and patient. They moved like professionals who understood that rushing would create opportunities for their targets to escape or set up ambushes. "We need to reach Sarah," Samuel told Marcus. "She's hidden about half a mile northeast near the ridgeline. If they find her while we're running from them, I know. But we can't lead them directly to her either." Marcus checked his ammunition with the efficiency of someone accustomed to combat situations. "These mountains provide good cover, but they also limit our escape routes. We need to turn this into our advantage instead of theirs." Samuel studied the terrain ahead, identifying potential ambush positions and natural choke points where two men might hold off a larger force temporarily. His military training had emphasized the importance of using environment as a force multiplier, turning disadvantages into tactical opportunities through creativity and determination. The bandana around his arm began soaking through with blood, reminding him that he was 62 years old with a bad knee and limited ammunition. Physical limitations that hadn't mattered during quiet morning hikes were becoming serious handicaps in a life-or-death pursuit through rough terrain. But experience counted for something, and Samuel had 40 years of law enforcement and military knowledge to draw upon. "There's a narrow canyon about 200 yards east," Samuel explained. "Single-file approach, limited visibility, good defensive positions. If we can get there first, we can control the engagement." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Classic terrain advantage. Force them to come at us on our terms instead of theirs." They began moving carefully through the underbrush, using deer paths and natural concealment to mask their progress. Behind them, radio chatter indicated their pursuers were expanding the search pattern, bringing in additional personnel from somewhere outside the immediate area. The criminal organization was larger than either Samuel or Marcus had realized, with resources that extended well beyond the five-man team at the cabin. Samuel's wounded arm throbbed with each movement, but Elena's bandana held the makeshift bandage in place. The fabric carried her scent, a mixture of fear and feminine strength that reminded him of Margaret during her final months when cancer had tested every ounce of her courage. Elena was fighting the same kind of battle against impossible odds, refusing to surrender despite overwhelming pain and terror. A rifle shot echoed through the forest, the bullet splintering bark inches from Samuel's head. Their pursuers had closed the distance faster than anticipated, forcing immediate tactical decisions that could determine whether anyone survived the next few minutes. "Canyon still 50 yards, Marcus reported, returning fire with controlled bursts that forced their attackers to seek cover. Samuel gripped Elena's bandana tighter and prepared for the sprint that would either save their lives or end them. The blood-stained fabric represented more than evidence of violence. It was a promise to a woman whose courage had inspired his own determination to fight against evil, regardless of personal cost. Samuel and Marcus found temporary refuge in the narrow canyon, where Sarah waited with wide eyes and trembling hands. Clutched against her chest was a small stuffed bear, worn soft from years of bedtime comfort. But as they caught their breath and planned their next move, Sarah revealed something that changed everything about their understanding of the situation. "I need to tell you something about my daddy," Sarah whispered, unzipping a hidden compartment in the bear's back. "Mommy doesn't know I saw her hide this, but I think it's why the bad men want to hurt us." From inside the stuffed animal, Sarah pulled out a small flash drive wrapped in plastic. The device was unremarkable, the kind used for storing computer files or backing up important documents. But Samuel's law enforcement experience recognized the care with which it had been concealed. People didn't hide flash drives inside children's toys unless the information they contained was dangerous enough to kill for. "Elena hid this?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with new understanding. Sarah nodded solemnly. She was crying when she put it inside Mr. Bear. She told me that if anything ever happened to her, I should give this to a policeman and tell them that Daddy was trying to do the right thing before he got arrested. Marcus examined the flash drive with growing excitement. This could contain financial records, account information, transaction histories. Everything we need to bring down the Herrera cartel's money laundering operation. The stuffed bear had been Sarah's companion through her parents' divorce, her father's arrest, and now this terrifying ordeal in the mountains. Its soft brown fur showed patches where she'd rubbed it for comfort during frightening moments. One ear was slightly torn, probably from being squeezed too tightly during bad dreams. It represented innocence and security, in a world that had taken both away from an 8-year-old. "Child," Samuel studied Sarah's face as she explained what she'd overheard during her parents' final arguments before the divorce. Miguel Martinez hadn't just been laundering money for the cartel. He'd been gathering evidence against them, planning to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence and protection for his family. The flash drive contained financial records that could expose the entire network, but Miguel had hidden it before his arrest, telling Elena only that she and Sarah would be safe as long as nobody knew the evidence existed. "The bad men keep asking Mommy about bank accounts," Sarah continued, "but she really doesn't know about those. Daddy never told her about the money stuff because he wanted to protect us. He only told her about this," she gestured to the flash drive, "right before the police came to arrest him." Marcus connected his encrypted phone to the flash drive, hoping for enough signal to transmit the information to his federal contacts. The device's screen illuminated with dozens of files containing banking records, wire transfer documentation, and coded communications between cartel members and their financial associates. It was a prosecutor's dream, enough evidence to dismantle a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise, but the phone showed the same no service message that had plagued all their communication attempts. The evidence existed, but they couldn't transmit it to authorities who could act on the information. They were still isolated in the mountains with criminals who would kill to prevent this evidence from reaching law enforcement. Why didn't Elena tell them about the flash drive? Samuel asked, because Daddy made her promise that only a real policeman could have it. He said the bad men have people working for them everywhere, even in the police sometimes. Mommy was supposed to wait until she was sure the policeman was one of the good ones. The weight of responsibility settled on Samuel's shoulders like a familiar burden. Elena was protecting this evidence even under torture because she understood its importance and trusted her ex-husband's judgment about who could be trusted with it. Miguel Martinez might have made mistakes that led to his arrest, but he'd also tried to do the right thing for his family and for justice. Samuel looked at the innocent stuffed bear that had concealed evidence capable of bringing down a major criminal organization. Sarah had carried the key to her own family's salvation without understanding its significance, protected by nothing more than a child's attachment to a beloved toy. Now that same evidence represented both their greatest hope for survival and their most dangerous liability. The criminals pursuing them didn't just want Elena's cooperation anymore. They needed to eliminate everyone who knew about the flash drive's existence. Samuel opened his weathered medical kit, the same emergency supplies he'd carried on every hiking trip for the past 3 years. The compact canvas case contained basic first aid materials that had seemed adequate for treating minor cuts and sprains during peaceful mountain excursions. Now, as he prepared to treat more serious injuries in a combat situation, the kit's limitations highlighted how completely their circumstances had changed, from routine recreation to life-or-death survival. The trap had been expertly conceived and flawlessly executed. While Samuel and Marcus had taken refuge in the canyon with Sarah, the criminals had used Elena as bait to draw them into an impossible choice. Over Marcus's radio, they'd transmitted Elena's voice, pleading for help, claiming she'd escaped and was hiding near the original trail where Samuel had first heard Sarah's cries. The message was designed to exploit every protective instinct that had driven Samuel to get involved in this situation. Marcus had recognized the tactical deception immediately, but Sarah's desperate insistence that they save her mother had forced them to respond. They couldn't explain to an 8-year-old child that her mother's pleas for help were being used as psychological warfare by professional criminals. The emotional manipulation was too sophisticated for a young mind to understand, and too powerful for adults to ignore completely. The ambush had been waiting when they approached the specified location. 3 gunmen positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, with Elena bound and visible just close enough to make rescue seem possible. Samuel had taken a rifle round through his shoulder during the first exchange, the bullet tearing through muscle and creating a wound that would require more treatment than his basic medical supplies could provide. Now, as he used gauze and antiseptic to clean the injury, Samuel reflected on how many times this kit had seemed like unnecessary weight during peaceful morning hikes. Margaret had insisted he carry emergency medical supplies after a friend had suffered a heart attack on a remote trail, requiring hours of first aid treatment before rescue personnel could reach them. The kit had been her final gift to his hiking routine, purchased during her last Christmas when cancer had already begun stealing her strength. "How bad is it?" Marcus asked, maintaining watch while Samuel worked on his wound. "I'll live, but my shooting accuracy is compromised." "Right shoulder took most of the damage." Samuel pressed medical tape over the bandage, trying to stabilize the dressing well enough to maintain mobility. "What's our tactical situation?" "They've got Elena positioned where we can see her, but can't reach her without exposing ourselves to crossfire. Classic hostage scenario, but complicated by terrain and our limited ammunition." Marcus scanned the area through his rifle scope. "They're not trying to kill us anymore. They want us alive for questioning about that flash drive." Sarah crouched beside Samuel as he repacked his medical kit, her small hands helping to organize supplies with the careful attention children brought to important adult tasks. She'd been remarkably calm during the gunfight, following instructions without panic and providing crucial intelligence about enemy positions based on her previous observations of the area. The medical kit represented more than emergency preparedness. It symbolized the careful planning that had defined Samuel's approach to retirement hiking, the same methodical attention to detail that had made him an effective sheriff. Every item had been selected for specific purposes, organized for quick access, maintained in working condition through regular inspection. Now those same qualities would determine whether they survived long enough to rescue Elena and escape with the evidence that could destroy the Herrera cartel. "They're moving Elena again," Marcus reported. "Looks like they're setting up for another attempt to draw us into an exposed position." Samuel tested his shoulder mobility, grimacing as torn muscle protested against movement. The wound would slow him down and affect his ability to handle weapons effectively, but it wouldn't prevent him from continuing the mission. He'd worked through worse injuries during his law enforcement career, including a knife wound that had required 12 stitches after a domestic violence call had turned into a fight for his life. "Sarah, I need you to stay here while Agent Rivera and I try a different approach to reach your mother. Can you do that for us?" The little girl nodded bravely, clutching her stuffed bear with one hand while holding the medical kit's carry strap with the other. "Will you bring Mommy back safe?" Samuel met her trusting gaze and made the same promise he'd made to countless crime victims during his sheriff career. "We're going to do everything possible to bring her home, sweetheart." Samuel reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the worn photograph of Margaret that he'd carried every day since her funeral. The image showed her laughing during their last hiking trip together, before the cancer had stolen her energy and left them both fighting a battle they couldn't win. Her smile radiated the strength that had sustained him through 30 years of marriage and 3 years of lonely retirement. Now facing what might be his final confrontation with evil, he drew courage from her memory. The photograph had been taken on this same mountain trail system during a weekend when Margaret had insisted on accompanying him despite her declining health. She'd made it only 2 miles before exhaustion forced them to turn back, but she'd been determined to share one more adventure in the wilderness that had become his refuge. They'd sat on a fallen log while she caught her breath, and Samuel had captured the moment when sunlight broke through the pine canopy to illuminate her face with golden warmth. Marcus emerged from his reconnaissance position with grim news. They've moved Elena to the cabin's front porch, tied to a chair where she's completely visible. The leader wants to negotiate face to face. He says he knows who you are, Sheriff, and that you two have unfinished business from Pine Ridge. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Someone from his past was orchestrating this criminal operation, using his law enforcement history as leverage in the current situation. 30 years of arrests, prosecutions, and courtroom testimony had created enemies who harbored grudges across decades. But which case, which criminal, which moment of justice had led to this confrontation in the mountains? Samuel studied Margaret's photograph, remembering how she'd worried about his safety during the more dangerous investigations. Drug cases, domestic violence situations, organized crime connections that sometimes reached into their small mountain community. She'd never asked him to choose a safer career, but she'd made him promise to come home to her every night, regardless of what dangers he faced. He's giving us 10 minutes to approach with our hands visible, or he starts cutting off Elena's fingers one by one until we surrender the flash drive. Marcus checked his watch with military precision. We're running out of options, Sheriff. The leader of this operation had waited until now to reveal their personal connection, using the knowledge as psychological warfare designed to destabilize Samuel's tactical thinking. It was a sophisticated approach that suggested extensive planning and detailed intelligence gathering about Samuel's background, personality, and likely responses to various forms of pressure. Sarah remained hidden in the canyon, with instructions to flee deeper into the wilderness if the rescue attempt failed. The flash drive was secured in her stuffed bear, protected by a child's innocence and a criminal's assumption that adults would keep the evidence with them during any confrontation. It was their insurance policy, ensuring that even if Samuel and Marcus died, the information needed to destroy the cartel would survive. Samuel tucked Margaret's photograph back into his pocket, feeling her presence like a blessing on whatever came next. She'd married a man who couldn't walk away from people in trouble, and she'd understood that some principles were worth dying for. During her final weeks, when pain had stripped away everything except essential truth, she'd made him promise to keep fighting for justice, even after she was gone. I need to see his face before I can identify him, Samuel told Marcus. 30 years of arrests creates a long list of potential enemies, but the personal nature of this suggests someone whose life I significantly impacted. A major case, probably involving family members or associates who remained free while he went to prison. Marcus nodded grimly. Standard procedure says we don't negotiate with hostage takers, but standard procedure also says we wait for backup and tactical support. Nothing about this situation fits normal parameters. The mountain wind carried Elena's voice from the cabin, weak but defiant as she continued refusing to provide information about bank accounts that existed only in her captor's imagination. Her courage reminded Samuel of Margaret's strength during chemotherapy treatments that had offered little hope but demanded everything she had to give. Both women faced impossible circumstances with dignity that humbled and inspired the men who loved them. Samuel checked his weapon and prepared for the walk that would either end this crisis or end his life. Margaret's photograph rested over his heart, a reminder that some battles were worth fighting regardless of odds or outcome. Love demanded courage, justice required sacrifice, and evil prospered only when good people chose safety over principle. Samuel and Marcus approached the cabin with their hands raised, while Elena worked frantically on a handwritten testimony that would serve as insurance against their deaths. Using a pencil and paper provided by her captors, she was documenting everything she knew about Miguel's evidence gathering, the flash drive's contents, and the cartel's operations. Her cramped handwriting filled page after page with details that could convict dozens of criminals, even if the digital evidence was destroyed. The testimony represented Elena's final act of defiance against the men who had terrorized her family. Even while tied to a chair on the cabin's front porch, bleeding from cuts inflicted during interrogation, she continued writing with determination that impressed even her captors. The document would serve as a roadmap for federal investigators, providing names, dates, locations, and methods that could unravel years of careful criminal planning. The criminal leader emerged from the cabin, and Samuel's blood ran cold with recognition. Vincent Herrera, brother of cartel boss Carlos Herrera, had been Samuel's most challenging arrest during his final year as sheriff. The case had involved a sophisticated drug distribution network that reached from Mexico to small mountain communities like Pine Ridge. Samuel's investigation had resulted in Vincent's conviction and a 20-year federal sentence, but apparently not before he'd escaped to plan this elaborate revenge. "Sheriff Samuel Mitchell," Vincent said with mock formality, "the man who destroyed my family and cost us millions in lost revenue. I've been planning this reunion for 3 years." Marcus maintained tactical position, while Samuel focused on the psychological warfare Vincent was attempting. Revenge-motivated criminals made different decisions than those driven by profit or necessity. They took unnecessary risks, prolonged confrontations for emotional satisfaction, and often revealed weaknesses that could be exploited by patient opponents. "Your family destroyed itself, Vincent. I just collected the evidence that proved it in court." Vincent's anger flared at the dismissive response, exactly what Samuel had hoped to achieve. Emotional criminals made mistakes, lost tactical focus, revealed information they should have kept secret. The key was maintaining pressure without pushing him toward violence against Elena, who remained the most vulnerable person in this confrontation. Elena continued writing her testimony, even as the confrontation escalated around her. Her cramped handwriting documented the names of cartel associates, the locations of safe houses, the methods used to transport and launder money. If this document survived, it would provide prosecutors with enough information to destroy the entire Herrera operation. "My brother Carlos sends his regards," Vincent continued. "He's very interested in recovering the evidence your friend Miguel gathered before his arrest. $2 million is significant money, but the banking records and transaction histories are worth much more. They could expose operations across 6 states. Samuel realized that Vincent's need for revenge was compromising the cartel's operational security. By revealing the scope of their criminal enterprise, he was providing Samuel and Marcus with intelligence that could be used against them. The smart move would have been to eliminate all witnesses immediately and disappear with whatever evidence they could recover. Instead, Vincent was prolonging the confrontation to satisfy personal grudges. Marcus caught Samuel's eye and gestured subtly toward positions they discussed during their approach. Federal tactical training emphasized patience during hostage situations, waiting for opportunities that criminals created through their own mistakes. Vincent's emotional investment in this confrontation was creating exactly the kind of opening they needed. Elena's testimony had reached its 3rd page, her handwriting growing smaller to fit more information on each sheet. The document contained detailed descriptions of money laundering techniques, lists of corrupt officials who facilitated cartel operations, and specific information about how Miguel had gathered evidence while working inside their financial network. It was a prosecutor's dream, assuming anyone survived, to deliver it to appropriate authorities. "Time's up, Sheriff. Tell me where the flash drive is hidden, or I start cutting pieces off your friend here." Vincent pulled a combat knife from his belt, the blade reflecting sunlight as he moved toward Elena's chair. The psychological pressure was designed to force immediate surrender, exploiting Samuel's protective instincts and sense of responsibility for innocent victims. But 30 years of law enforcement had taught Samuel that surrendering to criminals rarely improved outcomes for hostages. Elena looked up from her writing and met Samuel's eyes with calm determination. Her testimony was complete, a comprehensive document that would ensure justice even if none of them survived the next few minutes. She had transformed from victim to witness, using her final moments to strike back against the evil that had destroyed her family's peace. 6 hours after the final gunshot echoed through the mountain valley, Sarah sat at a makeshift table in the federal command post, carefully drawing with colored pencils on a piece of paper. Her artwork showed a tall figure in hiking clothes, holding a walking stick, with a cape flowing behind him like a superhero. Above the figure, she'd written Sheriff Sam in careful block letters, decorated with hearts and stars that sparkled across the page. The drawing represented how a terrified 8-year-old processed the events that had saved her mother's life and brought justice to the criminals who had shattered their world. In Sarah's mind, Samuel wasn't just a retired sheriff who'd happened to hear her cries for help. He was a hero who'd appeared when evil seemed unstoppable, armed with nothing but determination and the courage to do what was right regardless of personal cost. The federal tactical team had arrived 30 minutes after Samuel and Marcus had neutralized Vincent Herrera and his remaining associates. Elena's testimony, combined with the evidence from Miguel's flash drive, provided prosecutors with everything needed to dismantle the Herrera cartel's entire financial network. Dozens of arrests were planned across 6 states, targeting everyone from money launderers to corrupt officials who'd facilitated the criminal organization. Elena sat in an ambulance receiving medical treatment for her injuries, but she'd insisted on staying conscious long enough to see Sarah's drawing completed. The reunion between mother and daughter had been gentle and careful, both of them changed by their ordeal, but united by love that had survived the worst kind of violence. Elena's physical wounds would heal, but the emotional trauma would require months of professional counseling and patient family support. Samuel watched Sarah add details to her artwork, marveling at the resilience children showed when adults provided safety and stability after crisis situations. Her drawing included other figures too, her mother standing beside a house with a garden, Marcus wearing a badge and smiling, even herself represented as a small figure holding a teddy bear and standing between the adults who'd protected her. "She wants to give this to you," Elena said softly, her voice still hoarse from hours of interrogation and stress. "She told the trauma counselor that you're her hero now, and heroes should have pictures to remember their adventures." The federal agents were documenting evidence and preparing reports that would take months to process through the justice system. Vincent Herrera was dead, killed during the final confrontation when he'd chosen violence over surrender. His associates were in custody, facing charges that would ensure long prison sentences. The cartel's financial operations had been exposed and frozen, dealing a devastating blow to their ability to conduct future criminal activities. Marcus approached with news that Miguel Martinez would likely receive significant sentence reduction in exchange for his cooperation with the ongoing investigation. His evidence gathering had provided the foundation for destroying a criminal organization that had operated across multiple states for nearly a decade. Elena and Sarah would be eligible for witness protection programs if they chose to relocate, though the elimination of the immediate threat made such measures less necessary. Samuel studied Sarah's drawing, recognizing artistic talent that reminded him of Margaret's sketches during their early years together. His wife had encouraged local children to pursue creative interests, believing that art helped young minds process difficult experiences and express emotions they couldn't yet articulate in words. Sarah's superhero drawing served both purposes, transforming trauma into triumph through imagination and hope. The FBI wants to interview you about other cases that might connect to the Herrera investigation, Marcus explained. Your 30 years of law enforcement experience might help identify additional criminal networks that operated in your jurisdiction. But Samuel was focused on more immediate concerns. Sarah needed stability and security after surviving the worst kind of violence. Elena required time to heal physically and emotionally from her ordeal. The legal system would handle prosecutions and prison sentences, but the human cost of criminal violence required different kinds of attention and care. Sarah finished her drawing and presented it to Samuel with the formality of a child bestowing an important gift. "This is for you, Sheriff Sam, so you'll remember that you saved us." Samuel accepted the artwork with appropriate solemnity, understanding that it represented more than childish gratitude. It was recognition that good people could still triumph over evil when they chose courage over comfort, action over indifference. 3 months after the mountain rescue, Samuel sat in a family court waiting room, reviewing adoption paperwork that would make him Sarah's legal guardian, while Elena completed her recovery in a specialized trauma treatment facility. The documents represented a commitment he'd never expected to make during retirement, but circumstances had created a family where none had existed before. Elena's injuries, both physical and psychological, required intensive treatment that would take at least 6 months to complete. The adoption papers filled a thick manila folder, each page requiring careful review and signature. Background checks, home studies, financial assessments, and psychological evaluations had consumed weeks of Samuel's time. But every step brought him closer to providing Sarah with the stability she needed to heal from her ordeal. The legal process was thorough and sometimes frustrating, but it ensured that children were placed in homes capable of providing long-term care and emotional support. Elena had made the difficult decision to temporarily relinquish custody after her doctors explained that recovery from severe trauma required undivided attention and specialized treatment. She trusted Samuel completely, having witnessed his courage and compassion during the most terrifying experience of her life. The arrangement was intended to be temporary, but it would give Sarah consistency, while her mother regained the strength needed to rebuild their lives. Samuel's cabin had been transformed to accommodate an 8-year-old girl's needs. Sarah's bedroom was painted yellow with white trim, decorated with her artwork and photographs of happier times with her mother. A study area provided space for homework and creative projects. The living room now contained children's books, educational games, and the kind of comfortable furniture that encouraged family time and conversation. The most significant addition was a workshop where Samuel taught Sarah basic woodworking skills that helped channel her energy into constructive activities. She'd proven remarkably adept at simple carving projects, creating small animals and decorative items with patient concentration that reminded Samuel of his own childhood interests. The workshop provided therapy for both of them, offering quiet time to process their shared experiences while building something positive together. Sarah attended Pine Ridge Elementary School, where teachers and counselors monitored her adjustment with the careful attention that traumatized children required. Her academic performance was excellent despite the disruption in her life, and she'd made friends with other students who welcomed her into their social groups. The school principal had been briefed on her situation and ensured that appropriate support services were available when needed. Weekend visits with Elena at the treatment facility provided mother and daughter with opportunities to maintain their bond, while Elena worked through the psychological aftermath of her captivity. The sessions were supervised by therapists who helped both of them process their trauma in healthy ways. Elena's progress was steady but slow, requiring patience from everyone involved in her recovery process. Samuel had established a trust fund for Sarah's education using the reward money he'd received for helping to dismantle the Herrera cartel. The federal government had offered substantial compensation for his role in the investigation, money that would ensure Sarah could attend any college she chose when the time came. Elena had insisted that Samuel keep the funds, recognizing that he'd earned them through courage and sacrifice that had saved her daughter's life. The adoption paperwork included detailed provisions for Elena's eventual resumption of parental rights when her treatment was completed. Samuel would remain involved in Sarah's life as a grandfather figure, providing continuity and support during her transition back to living with her mother. The arrangement recognized that trauma had changed all their relationships, creating bonds that would persist long after legal custody was resolved. Sarah's therapeutic progress was remarkable, aided by the stability Samuel provided and the professional counseling she received twice weekly. She still experienced nightmares occasionally, but they were decreasing in frequency and intensity. Her trust in adults was rebuilding gradually, supported by consistent care and the security of knowing that people she loved were committed to her well-being. The judge called Samuel's name, and he gathered the adoption papers with steady hands. The legal proceedings would formalize relationships that had already formed through shared crisis and mutual caring. Sarah would have a guardian who understood responsibility and possessed the patience needed to help her navigate the complex emotions that followed traumatic experiences. Walking into the courtroom, Samuel reflected on how completely his retirement had changed direction. Instead of solitary hiking and quiet reflection, his days now included school pickup, homework supervision, bedtime stories, and the countless small responsibilities that came with caring for a child. 6 months after the mountain rescue, Samuel stood at the trailhead where his adventure had begun, holding a new walking stick that Sarah had carved for him during their woodworking sessions together. The fresh oak bore intricate designs that revealed her growing artistic skill and the steady hands that came from months of patient practice. Near the handle, she'd burned the words "For Sheriff Sam" in careful lettering, along with small hearts that represented the love she'd learned to trust again after surviving unthinkable trauma. The new walking stick felt different in Samuel's hands, lighter somehow than the original that had been lost during the final confrontation with Vincent Herrera's men. Sarah had selected the oak herself from fallen branches near their cabin, insisting that heroes deserved equipment made with care rather than simply purchased from stores. She'd spent 3 weeks shaping and sanding the wood, guided by Samuel's instruction, but driven by her own determination to create something meaningful. Elena walked beside them on the familiar trail, her physical recovery complete and her emotional healing advanced enough to allow family outings in the mountains where their ordeal had unfolded. The trauma counseling had been successful, though she still carried scars that would never completely disappear. Her relationship with Sarah had been rebuilt carefully, with professional guidance and Samuel's steady support providing the foundation for renewed trust and communication. The adoption had become permanent when Elena's doctors determined that single parenthood would compromise her continued recovery. She'd made the difficult decision to share custody with Samuel, recognizing that Sarah had formed bonds that transcended traditional family structures. The arrangement provided Elena with the support she needed while ensuring Sarah's continued stability and emotional security. Sarah skipped ahead on the trail with the boundless energy of childhood resilience, her laughter echoing through the pine trees that had witnessed so much violence and fear just months earlier. She'd grown 2 inches since coming to live with Samuel. Her face had filled out from regular meals and peaceful sleep, and her eyes had regained the bright curiosity that trauma had temporarily stolen. The mountains no longer frightened her because she'd learned that good people could triumph over evil when they refused to surrender to fear. The federal prosecutions had been successful beyond anyone's expectations. Elena's testimony and Miguel's evidence had resulted in convictions that dismantled the Herrera cartel's operations across 6 states. Dozens of criminals were serving long prison sentences. Corrupt officials had been removed from positions of authority, and financial institutions had been forced to implement new security measures that made money laundering significantly more difficult. Marcus Rivera had been promoted within the DEA and assigned to lead a new task force targeting international criminal organizations. He visited Pine Ridge regularly, partly for professional consultations with Samuel about ongoing investigations, but mostly to maintain the friendship that had formed during their shared crisis. Sarah called him Uncle Marcus and had appointed herself his unofficial hiking guide whenever he visited the mountains. Samuel's retirement had taken an unexpected direction, but he'd found purpose that had been missing during his 3 years of solitary grief. Caring for Sarah, supporting Elena's recovery, and consulting with law enforcement agencies about criminal networks had given his life meaning that simple hiking and peaceful reflection couldn't provide. Margaret would have understood and approved, recognizing that he'd found a way to honor her memory while serving the principles that had guided their marriage. The trail ahead stretched into wilderness that no longer held terrors for any of them. Sarah ran back to take Samuel's hand, chattering about the squirrels she'd spotted and the flowers that were beginning to bloom with spring's arrival. Elena smiled with genuine happiness for the first time since her ordeal, watching her daughter experience the joy and security that every child deserved. Samuel gripped the walking stick Sarah had made for him and felt the weight of responsibility that had defined his adult life. The mountains stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and challenging, and full of possibilities for adventure that didn't involve violence or fear. They had survived the worst that evil could inflict and emerged stronger, more united, and more appreciative of the simple blessings that made life worth protecting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but today offered the perfect combination of family, purpose, and peace that Samuel had thought he'd lost forever when Margaret died. The new walking stick would carry him forward into whatever adventures awaited, supported by love and guided by principles that no amount of violence could destroy.